Hi everyone, it's Katie from Chords Records. Welcome to my channel. Elyse Weinberg, an amazing singer, songwriter, folk musician that sort of came from Canada in the 1960s. Have you heard of her? It's just extraordinary how sometimes amazing pieces of art, in this case her only album released in her kind of modern lifetime, kind of went unnoticed. And it's recently been discovered, probably in the last sort of this century, but coming out of the 60s, and she eventually just went into obscurity and led a normal life. But this woman, when I tell you how talented she was, you'll be blown away. You may never heard of her. I know some of you will have. But I was blown away when I discovered her, and I just want to take you on a small journey of who she is and the music she created. So she was born, Elyse Weinberg, her name, was born in 1945 in Canada, and very soon as a child moved to Montreal. And then in her sort of teens and early 20s, she moved to Toronto and started hanging out with a whole bunch of other people in their early 20s by the name of Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Ian and Sylvia, Gordon Lightfoot, this absolute treasure trove of magnificent Canadian folk musicians that came out of that era. They were all playing together, all singing together, hanging out together in the very vibrant Toronto folk scene in the mid to late 60s. So Elyse Weinberg was in this world, and she was learning guitar, she was playing music with the likes of Neil Young, and they became very good friends. And she eventually moved to New York very briefly on her way to moving to LA specifically to visit Neil Young, who had just started Buffalo and Springfield. But let me take a step back. While she was in Toronto, she formed a band called the O.D. Budkins and Company, featuring Ken Coblin, who was in The Squires with Neil Young. So they were all hanging out. Neil Young eventually moves to LA, and Elyse Weinberg goes to visit him. She ends up staying, she befriends Mama Cass, and she stays with Mama Cass. And Mama Cass kind of was her first kind of champion, if you like, the one that really believed in her. So by this age, it's sort of 1967, 68, and she's in her early 20s. She's, 22, 23. And Mama Cass introduces her to Ron Silver, Mama Cass's manager at the time. Now, Ron Silver had formed a record label called, I'm going to have to look at this because I can't ever get my sort of tongue around it. The record label is Tetragrammaton. So it didn't last very long, but they did sign her to this label. So Ron Silver became her manager, signed her to the label, and in 1968 she released her one and only album in this current form, self-titled Elyse. And this is my original copy. This is like a holy grail. Look at that. It looks like a bootleg on the back. It's all kind of handwritten liner notes. But if you can look at the cover just quite carefully, you can see her style of music was very much from that sort of folk psychedelia, kind of folk rock kind of genre, if you like, medieval folk. And it was all about life and death. And if you look at this beautiful cover, it's almost like I think it's been almost watercolored in the original print. But the forms that make up her name are actually bones. You can see the little foot here. And this is obviously a maiden who's probably met her death, being with a knight kneeling over her in some kind of, and a dragon slaying the whole situation. So quite an extraordinary album cover, and it does kind of hark to her music. It kind of gives you an indication of what is going to be revealed when you start playing. So this, and on the back, it's called Band of Thieves. There was a young thief who used to attack travellers passing along the way where he lived, etc., etc. And on the liner notes of who was on it, it says Colin Walcott played sitar and tabla, Maureen on the spoons, and Brent mouth and harp. Basic tracks by the Band of Thieves, vocals 6 and 12 string by Elyse Weinberg. Now that Band of Thieves included Neil Young. He plays guitar on this album. It is so incredible. It's slightly an acquired taste, as a lot of that kind of psychedelic folk is. Her voice is very, almost reaching for notes and a bit belty and a bit graspy, but the songs are quite extraordinary, and she's written the entire album. It starts with the first track, Band of Thieves, which I think became a mild hit. It's a little bit dubious whether it made the Billboard Top 100, I'm not sure. And then the Bert Jansch song Deed I Do, that's the only cover on here, and the rest are all hers. There is a fantastic song on here called Mortuary Bound. We're all bound for 6 feet under, essentially. It's a song about death, but it's very bluesy and folky and psych. It's just this kind of gorgeous banging rhythm. And the final song, If Death Don't Overtake Me. So the first album, Elyse, was recorded in 1968 and released in 1969. She then went on to record another album. And that album, Grease, Paint, Smile, was shelved because the label went bankrupt. She was falling out with Ron Silver at the time, so we're talking 1970, 71, and she was soon signed to David Geffen's Asylum label. So this is very early days of the Asylum label. She was being talked about in the same breath as Joni Mitchell and Laura Nyro. So articles like Newsweek were writing articles about these three women, and they were being talked about in the same breath. Now, when she was assigned, so she's already got this album, that's second album, which has been recorded but was never released because the studio went bankrupt. She's now signed to Asylum. She records a third album, and that album, Wildfire, is still in the vault. It was never released. And soon after, she just went, you know what? I don't know if I want... She got out just in time of the music business. It wasn't a business that she was drawn to. In fact, she was being drawn into spirituality. So just before this happened, she had one last crack. Sonny and Cher particularly Cher was starring in her first film, Chastity, and they had used the first track of this album, Band of Thieves, in the film. They'd renamed it Chastity, and she went along to the film all excited to see her name in the credits, and in the credits, all songs by Sonny Bono, and he took credit for her original song. So that must have been heartbreaking and unbelievable, and quite disillusioning, I imagine. And so that plus her second and third albums being shelved, she then retired from the music business for a long, long time. She discovered spirituality, got into numerology, I think, and eventually ended up in Santa Fe, and wasn't really performing too much live. She in fact changed her name. Now, fast forward, and she sort of kind of fell out of existence, sort of fell out of the sort of musical kind of history, except one day in year 2000, Elf Power, the band Elf Power, the guy there, Andrew Rieger, was flipping through a $1 bin and found this. And I can tell you I didn't pay $1 for this. I paid a lot more. But he found this in a $1 bin. Eventually, once he got his turntable working again, he played it. And he and his bandmate, Laura Carter, couldn't believe what they heard. And through a series of connections, they found Elyse and asked her, can we re-release it under our label? Elf Power had their own label called Twin Orange. And they did release it in 2001. They re-released this, except it had 2 new songs on it from this unreleased second album, which features, let me just read you the lineup of this second album. Now, this second album was the second album that was released that got shelved because the label went bankrupt. Grease Paint Smile. On it, she's joined by Neil Young, J.D. Souther on drums, Kenny Edwards from the Stone Ponies on bass, and guitarist Nils Lofgren, of course, from E Street Band and Crazy Horse. So a superstar musician lineup on this second album. To that point, it had never been released, but they took one of the songs, Horses, and put it as a bonus track on the reissue of this album. Now, I will say, if you go to the Twin Orange website, which you still can do, it's the Elephant Collective, if you're familiar with it. The Elephant Collective are a bunch of people out of Athens in Georgia, Elf Power, but the most famous is Neutral Milk Hotel, bunch of other people. You can still go to that website and buy the CD of this. The vinyl's long out of print, but you can buy the CD, and I'd highly suggest it. So that kind of propelled her back into a kind of a new common sort of understanding of the musical history out of the 60s. And people like Courtney Barnett started covering this song, Houses. So she started getting a little bit more of a fan base. And because of that, the Nyro group in 2015, who they've got a knack for finding rare, unreleased, long-lost material, were able to release in full that second album called Grease Paint Smile. So that is long out of print as well on vinyl, but you can still get it on CD. So that album is far more kind of rocky. It's or kind of traditional rock, folk rock, whereas this one is way more. It's out there. It's psychedelic. It's almost like early Janis Joplin, the Big Brother and the Holding Company, sort of. So that first album has been reissued in 2001, and the second album issued for the first time, taken out of the vaults. The third album, which was recorded by Asylum in 1971-2, is still in the vault. Never been released. So if anyone watching this has any power, can you please find a way to find this album and release it? I don't know what strings you need to pull or what has to happen to make that happen, but how can great music still be in the vault? I don't understand. So a couple of fun extra facts about this is that she changed her name to Corey Bishop, and when she discovered spirituality, and she led a very normal life. In fact, she ended up in insurance, but she still kept writing music. And when she was rediscovered in the 2000s, she would give interviews and happily chat about her past kind of life from 20, 30, 40 years ago. But she was still recording music. And in fact, in 2009, she recorded her fourth album, In My Own Sweet Time, which was kind of a nod to the fact I will record in my own sweet time and release an album kind of every decade. It's quite fun. And if you can hear that on Spotify. So by this stage in 2009, she's probably 59, 60. And if you didn't know that, and you listen to the music, it's really fantastic. Like there is no, you don't have any unconscious bias about who it is, um, or, or who's singing it or who's writing it. If you just listen to it blindly, the musicianship is brilliant, and I can't find any credits for who's on that album. But give it a listen and let me know what you think. And so I want to kind of pay tribute to people like this. I've done a previous video on Laura Nyro, who's far more famous than she was, but still not that well known in more modern kind of contemporary times. I've done a video on Karen Dalton, all these fantastic women that came out of the 60s, and it's emerging as this really fantastic collection of albums that I have, and one day I'll put them all together and create a video. But I wanted to introduce you to Elyse, and you can check her out on Cubus or Spotify. Her music is up there. Tell me what you think. A kind of a sort of unsung hero of the late 60s with this incredible debut album. Her subsequent album was re-released in 2016. Her third album has never been released. And this is a woman who was recording with the likes of Neil Young, J.D. Souther. Would love to hear that third album, Wildfire, if we can ever find it. So I hope you enjoyed this little deep dive into a single artist and this woman, Elyse Weinberg. Let me know what you think and tell me if you do know her and what else you know about her. I'd love to know more. And I'll see you in my next video. Thanks very much.